Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest is Brandon McGinley. Now, he's the editor for EWTN Publishing, and he's here to talk about the book, Sanctify Your Daily Life, How to Transform Work into a Source of Strength, Holiness, and Joy, originally put together by Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, with a foreword by Lech Walesa. It's great to have you here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful for you to visit us here on Bookmark. You're a book guy. And let me ask you, before we talk about how you got into working on this particular work, how you got into working for EWTN. What were you doing before you became EWTN's publishing editor?
Sure. I was actually working for a pro-family public policy organization in Pennsylvania, where I still live and work, and I had done some. In fact, I was here on this program with you talking about a book at one point that I did on Catholic fatherhood,
right?
And kind of got me into the Catholic publishing world.
And you were and you were willing to come back on again.
Yes,
so
exactly, exactly. Yeah.
I noticed that alliteration. You got Pennsylvania, pro-life,
yes,
public policy. So you were always a writer at heart, were you?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I wrote in college, and I was really blessed to come out of college and within a few years have some opportunities to do it again. And for a bigger community than college, which was very, very nice.
Let me ask you, for most of our audience out there, when they hear about Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, they go, gee, doesn't quite ring a bell. But there's a big connection between him and somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Cardinal Wyszynski was the mentor, both in terms of the intellectual life, but also in terms of the political and kind of ecclesial status of Europe in the mid-20th century for Karol Wojtyla, who became Pope John Paul II. In fact, Cardinal Wyszynski championed him at the conclave that elected him as Pope John Paul II, and you see actually in a lot of John Paul II's work, especially his social teaching, the influence of Cardinal Wyszynski in this book.
Right, exactly. And you found that as you went through and reviewed it.
Yeah, and as I learned about Cardinal Wyszynski's life, he's a figure who's known throughout Europe, and certainly in Poland there are statues of him everywhere. He's a huge figure,
and he's venerable now, right?
He's venerable, exactly, and named just a few months ago by Pope Francis, and you know, if it weren't for John Paul II, Cardinal Wyszynski would have been known as the great Polish prelate of the 20th century, one of the great prelates in all of Europe in the 20th century.
Right.
But he ended up being overshadowed by his mentor. But I don't think he would have had it any other way.
Right. Exactly. The spiritual leader of Poland showed us in his pastoral teaching the noble character of work and taught us how to understand our dignity as workers. Then, when we launched our struggle against communism, his fatherly wisdom inspired us and gave us strength to overcome the great sufferings we endured. Now, this is from the 1995 edition of this book, and this was Lech Walesa, president of Poland.
Yes, yeah, he was a spiritual advisor, the primary spiritual advisor to Lech Walesa and his Solidarity movement. He was really essential in not only, he was essential in maintaining their relationship with the people and with the communist government. In fact, it was really incredible that when Cardinal Wyszynski died, even though he had spent a few years in prison under the communists, he had so earned the respect both of the Polish people and of the communist leaders that when he died, he was given 4 days. There were 4 days of mourning in his honor, and both the communists and the people celebrated him because he maintained his own integrity and he maintained the spiritual life of the people of Poland while also doing everything he could to make sure that there could be some sort of a relationship was kept for the people and the leaders who wanted to who were trying to destroy the church.
Right, and obviously we're talking about this edition originally came out in 1946. We're coming out of World War II, where Poland, for some short period of time, thought they were going to be freed until the Russians rolled over them on their way to Berlin and decided to stay.
Right.
And so it's kind of, in a way, reading this book and about work, you're thinking of this kind of almost black and white world that a lot of people found themselves in. But you say in the editor's note at the beginning that you hold in your hands one of the classic works of practical theology of the past century. What is practical theology?
Yeah, I think Cardinal Wyszynski, and you could see this certainly throughout his life, but especially in this book, is one of those shows is kind of a master of taking high theological concepts and then transmitting them in a deeply pastoral mode. Many people kind of think that they can do it, but he really, really able to take these deep truths about human nature, about our relationship with God, and then say, how does this impact your day-to-day life? How can you live these out in a way that is comprehensible to the average man on the street? And in that regard, I think it's a really beautiful work.
Well, in the beginning, there's a quote you have in here in part: work must ennoble not only what is material, work must also ennoble the person who works so that he does not feel denigrated or cheated by the work that he does. And I think, like you said earlier, you hear John Paul II in that, about the dignity of work. We hear it with our President Holy Father as well, but you think of also that whole idea of dealing with a dialectical materialism of communism at the time.
Excuse me. I think that's really important, because he's writing in a particular context. They're coming out of Nazism, going into communism, and both of those ideologies valued work, but in a very peculiar sense, in the sense that work only really had value in as much as it served the state. And even though, of course, they're coming at it from different perspectives, both those ideologies basically have that notion that work is valuable only in as much as it serves the collective.
It's kind of utilitarianism.
Yes, exactly. And what Cardinal Wyszynski wants to say, and says so effectively, is he reasserts the individual value of work. He acknowledges the social value of work. Work brings us into contact with people. It serves the common good in a deeply Catholic sense, but it's also individually dignifying and individually sanctifying even.
The introduction here, I thought was interesting. The endless hardship of work links man's most precious faculties, his physical strength and spiritual powers, in an indissoluble union. And I guess it strikes against that kind of dualistic idea that's out there, that people try to say this is spiritual in a material world.
Absolutely. Right? If there's one word that I would use to describe kind of the anthropological kind of notions in the book, it would be integration. He talks all the time about the integration of the interior life with the exterior work that we're doing. And if our interior life is not in order, then our work will not be meritorious.
Right. In chapter 1, the problem of work today, he says, as I see it, is of considerable importance for the whole of Catholic religious, moral, and aesthetic life, that there should be a right understanding of work itself and the role it plays in human life. Not merely the personal role, but the social one, not merely the economic role, but the religious one as well. Integration of work into the fullness of that life, so that work is no longer something cut off from the rest, but something that forms a harmonious whole with it.
Yeah, I think that we live in an age of disintegration, where things that are supposed to be together, that are supposed to be whole, are broken apart. And so we see our work life as being just totally separate from our home life, and we constantly are doing this disintegration where our duties here are different from our duties here. And what Cardinal Wyszynski wants to say is that that our duties to God don't change based on whether we're at work or we're at home. We can, yes, we can pray at home, yes, we can pray in the church, but we can also, in fact, we must pray at work. And in fact, we can actually turn work into a kind of prayer.
It's interesting. A Catholic view of work is not understood, he says. And then he brings up something that always kind of troubled me on some ways in looking at Catholic countries in relation to, let's say, a Protestant country. And at this time he also talked about communist countries or Protestant. But the idea of the work ethic and the fact that the idea that you can't really learn anything about work from a Catholic country because they don't work very well.
I think when you mentioned that, and that's at the beginning of the book, but I think it ties into something at the end of the book, which is the value that the Church has traditionally has traditionally placed on Sunday and other holy days. The word holiday is just a combination of holy day. And we had many of them, and they were feasts, and they were times not just of rest, but of consecration, of consecrating our rest and our work to God. And I think that the Catholic notion of having this kind of robust sense of leisure and of rest is sometimes mistaken for laziness, when in fact it's actually part of the integration, integrating work and leisure into a complete life.
He talks about illuminating the Catholic view. He talks about the parable of the laborers who went into the vineyard. He said, the householder is concerned about something quite different than many of us think he's concerned, that no one should live without work. We feel as if it's a reproach and a query, how is that you are standing here and have done nothing all day? And you think of all the time you've heard that parable, the focus usually is it fair that somebody only works an hour and still gets to heaven, or fair that somebody, and whether it has to do with the Gentiles and the Jews or whatever the Lord said. but to focus on the whole idea that the Lord didn't want anyone not to be able to work.
Right, right. Yeah, and this goes to something that he focuses on that I think sometimes we get wrong, which is we sometimes think that work is a product of the fall. But he points out that Adam and Eve were tasked to tend the garden. There was work to be done. What comes with the fall is the hardship of work, the drudgery of work. That is what comes from the fall. But when it comes to work on its own, work is part of human nature.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting here. He talks about the idea. Christ's question that's in an earlier paragraph is asked today of those who have no pressing need to work since they possess accumulated wealth. Then he goes, they too are told that they have nonetheless a duty to work. They are reminded in a simplified form of St. Paul's statement, he that does not work, neither let him eat. Now that's one of those ones that always seems to run. You've got St. Paul saying that, and then we've got the Beatitudes, or
sure,
taking care of people. How do you balance that, those two sayings?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, I think. And I think that one of the things that he does here, as you mentioned, is that rather than focusing on poverty when he's speaking of that, he's actually talking, as you mentioned, he's talking about actually the rich, that the rich also have a duty to work. And so this idea, and I think that, in the era in which he's writing, especially, kind of detaching the notion of work from being only referring to wage labor also is important here, because there's valuable work to be done that is not compensated in the economy. Right. Parenting, of course, comes to mind. Serving the elderly. There's all kinds of things that we can do. So I think that also gets to this notion of there's more work to be done than that which is just compensated.
Well, you say many people, and this kind of dovetails into what we were talking about with the Protestant work ethic countries before. Many people do not consider contemplation and other mental occupations as work at all. Religious orders are recognized only if, and this is very prescient today, they are social, educational, or active, while contemplative orders are regarded as social parasites.
Yes, yes. He talks often about spiritual work. And it almost sounds like an oxymoron to modern ears, but it's so important. It's so important to the traditional church understanding of work, and it's so important to understanding what work should be today. Because if you eliminate that, then you're already right on the road to materialism. If the only work that's valuable is work that is active in the material world, then we have denigrated an entire whole. Not only have we denigrated contemplative communities, but we've denigrated an entire realm of human activity.
It's interesting too. In the images of God's work, he points out Christ himself was a worker, obviously, certainly for the first 30 years before he went out. Sure. The Christ's apostles also were workers. So the idea that work was always important, church is always honored. And then he makes a point that I had never really thought of. The pagans despised every kind of work, even artistic work. They regarded physical work as unworthy of man. It was the duty of the slaves, kind of going back to the rich people.
Right.
It could not be reconciled with the sublimity of the free mind, for it's limited it too much and made it dependent both on itself and others. So that whole idea that there isn't anything good in work. You're trying to get out of work. That's what you have slaves for.
Right, exactly. Yes, yeah. And I'm glad that he attributes that to a kind of pre-Christian paganism, because it points out, again, how in Christianity we have this integration of life, that we bring work into a complete life, and in its proper context, and with the proper interior disposition. Right. The difficulties of work that come from the fall can be sanctified and sanctifying.
Right. He points out Christianity really is what brought the elevation of the status of work. In chapter 3, he talks about work as a need of human nature, and also says it's a duty. So is it a need or a duty, or it's both?
I think it goes back to what we were saying before, and that I think it is both. It is work is part of how we kind of fulfill our nature, and so it is part of human nature, and that way it is a need, but it is because fulfilling our nature is what we are meant to do, is what God has created us for. It is also a duty. The two can actually go hand in hand.
You said it before, and this struck me. I hadn't thought about it until I actually read the book. Man was intended to work even in paradise.
Yes.
And you had alluded to, you talk about the idea that from time to time, people are seized by a longing for those future happy times when work will show itself to be superfluous. Man's liberation from work is a tempting thought, but he says, is there not some misunderstanding here?
And this was 1946, and now here we are in 2018, and we are hearing the exact same things, that work will someday be superfluous, that machines will do all our work, and that will be a good thing, and people will have all kinds of leisure time to do whatever they want. And it goes to, you know, we were saying before, this was written in a particular historical context, and Nazism and communism and so on and so forth, but it's also timeless. I mean, that remark, that idea that, you know, that there's this idea in the air 80 years, 70 years ago that that work might someday be superfluous is still here with us, and it's only accelerated.
Work is one of the means of our spiritual progress. That's where he ties it together. It has to be performed in such a way that man becomes better, not only in a sense of physical efficiency, but also in a moral sense. This truth is almost completely forgotten today. He goes on to say, we even consider that excessive work frees us from the duty of molding our own souls.
Yes.
So the idea that sometimes when we're so busy, I don't have to think about things I don't want to think about.
Right. In that sense, kind of overwork can be sought out by people as a way to avoid having to worry about the spiritual life. But he also points out that to the extent that that someone is working too much, especially to the extent that a society or a director of work is overworking an employee, to the extent that it becomes difficult to focus on the interiority of life, that is itself deeply unjust.
Yeah, he says, to break with the notion that assigns only one aim to work, which is the satisfaction and needs of our existence, which certainly would have been the situation in a communist state, and to return to the one real judgment by which work is not so much a sad necessity and a mere safeguard against hunger and thirst as it is in need of the rational nature of man who gets to know himself fully through work and learns to express himself completely in it.
Yeah, that completely, I think, is a great word, because it goes again to that integration, that work is not just a physical expression of strength. Work can also be, in fact should be, an expression of moral strength, an expression of spiritual strength. He talks often about ensuring that our interior disposition is towards God. And so no matter how hard we work, if we're not dedicating it to God, and he talks also, no matter how much money you make, no matter if you're just working for money, or if you're just working for to earn the kind of credentials or so on and so forth, or awards, if that's your primary purpose, then that's not meritorious in the Lord's eyes. We need that interior disposition, that integrated disposition that points our work to God and dedicates it to Him.
In his section, Work as a Social Duty, he says, the bond that arises in human work is the radiance of love. For work itself is indeed love. It is the showing forth, the witnessing of love. What is he trying to get to?
So one of the things one of my favorite takeaways from the book is the idea of work as work necessarily brings us into contact with creation, and thus with God, but also necessarily, even today, even if you're like, I work from home, but I'm still in touch with other people, even if just digitally, work necessarily brings you in contact with other people, and thus brings you in contact with God, and thus offers opportunities for pursuing the good together. That is to say, the common good of a group, or of a larger community, or of a society, or even of the entire human species. Right.
In the section, the use of the fruits of work, he says private property should serve the common good, and no man is free to do just what he likes with these surplus goods. Everyone has a duty to use what is left over for social purposes in the spirit of love on one's neighbor, charity, and magnanimity.
Yeah, and here he's channeling the ancient church tradition that goes back to St. Basil and St. Ambrose, that whatever left over you have that you don't need is not to be used however you like. It is for the maintenance of the poor, it is for the maintenance of the elderly, it is for the maintenance of those who cannot work. That's something he talks about a lot, that if you have the ability to work, as most people do, one of the duties you have in using your work and in earning things through your work is to work so that those who physically or for whatever other reason cannot work can be maintained.
Right. And again, as with the poor, certainly as we hear in Scripture about the widows and orphans, as they talk about, in the human work as cooperation with God, the world in God's thought must undergo a further transformation with the help of human work carried out in the name of the same command. Fill the earth and subdue it.
Oh, yes. Subdue is a word that can, and dominion is another word, of course, that we hear in that same part of Scripture, and that can sound overwhelming, or can sound almost domineering. But what we're talking about is not subduing the earth for our own ends, not subduing the earth just so that we can enjoy ourselves better, but subduing the earth for the end, for the purpose of glorifying God. And he talks about how, you know, to the extent that we are shaping God's creation to make room for more people, that's a great good, because we are shaping God's kind of unruly creation and bringing it under our dominion so that we can create more people who glorify God.
That even at that time in 46, the idea of overpopulation, that there's not room enough for enough people. He's saying, no, that's not true.
Absolutely, yeah. He wants there to be as many people as we can fit on this planet because those are more people who can glorify God.
I thought this was interesting. Work as love for the Creator. We come to know God through our work. And he says, the closer people are to nature, the more strongly they sense the nearness of God. People in the country are more religious, not because they're less exposed to corruption, but because they are in closer touch with nature.
This was as a city dweller myself, this was a bit cutting, but yeah, I think he's pointing to something. This is what we were saying before about how work doesn't just bring us in touch with other people. Work necessarily brings us in touch with creation, so that we can mold it, so that we can be in touch with what God has made for us. And so I think city dwellers might take a little bit of issue with that, but there's definitely this idea that even in city life, and I think we even see this now, even under secular understandings, we want to bring more of the country to the city, bring more nature to the city, put up trees, have parks, and even though this often doesn't come from an obviously or explicitly religious mindset, I think it is emerging for something that we know deep inside of us, that we need to be in touch with nature, and not in some sort of kind of hippie way, but in a sense of kind of a deep communion, integration of our life with what creation was made for us.
In the section, prayer through work and prayer are not alien to one another, therefore even at the outset, in fact, prayer in work will only be a conclusion drawn from these truths. It will be both necessary of work and at the same time of its joy. Then he talks about the love of God in work has 4 consequences. And maybe we can run through the first consequence. He says, is that we love God in work. The second one is that we love God, we long to please Him by yielding to His will. The third is that we love God interiorly, we want to submit our life to Him completely. And the fourth consequence is that if we love God, we wish to have the same intention in our work as He has. What intention is that?
So he makes a really interesting analogy. It may have been right here, it may have been somewhere else, I don't remember exactly, but between God and man and matter. And so God makes and shapes us in His image, and then when we work with matter, when we work, this we're saying, with the same intention as God, to then mold matter in such a way that's conducive to us, we are acting in a sense like God. We are analogically acting like God with creation in the same way that He works with us. And so in the same way that He creates us for His glory, we can work with matter for His glory.
In the interior life and excessive work, he said, works of the Spirit must come before other works. We have in mind the spirituality of our external work, the primacy of the Spirit over action and over matter. Again, that idea, works of the Spirit must come before other works. That's where sometimes it seems to me that sometimes people trying to live out their faith or their religious works get the cart before the horse, as they say.
Sure, yeah. And here's that word again, that word integration. Integrating the spiritual with the external. But and this is what he said right there, is giving primacy to the spiritual. That if our spirits aren't right, if our hearts aren't ordered properly, then neither will our work be ordered properly.
Right. One of the other things he talks about in chapter 15 is a word I never saw before, the virtue of longanimity in work. To speak today of the virtue of longanimity is almost demoralizing. It was demoralizing for me because I had never heard it before. Can you explain what it is?
It's a beautiful word, and one that I learned also just in the past few months. And it has that word long right in there. It's the idea of taking a long-term view of things, and it's a delayed gratification. It's almost looking at time through God's eyes, that we might not even see the fruits of the work that we do right now, but we can look beyond the horizon to see that we are still doing good, and maybe it's the good that will only be appreciated by future generations. He uses the example, I think it's beautiful, And parents will recognize this just from their own lives. But he uses the example of a farmer who plants an orchard. And maybe in his lifetime we'll see some fruits of that, but there's a good chance that that orchard will not fully come to maturity until after the farmer has died. And that doesn't mean the work's not good. The work is deeply good. The work it has that virtue of longanimity, that looking beyond the horizons that we can see. And of course, parenting is a great example of this. That all the little bits of discipline, all that you do with a 2 or 3-year-old, it's hard to imagine that person as a 23-year-old. But the work that's done right now is for that long-term good.
Right. In chapter 16, perseverance and constancy work, we think of our confirmation and perseverance and fortitude kind of coming together. So when you actually worked on this book, how long did it take you to review it and put it together?
Well, in this case, it was pretty easy because the work was so good. And so for me, this was just a question of getting a handle on the book, putting together an editor's note, and getting it ready to go to the bookshelves.
So when you're doing all these editing, we're kind of putting out about a book a month or so for EWTN Publishing, and we've got some great books. Father Horgan's book is out there.
Absolutely.
David Andrews' book is going to be out as well. What about your own writing? Any other plans for that, or you're too busy?
I mean, I do an essay here or there, but mostly I'm just working on these great EWTN books, and glad to see them on the bookshelves.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by Bookmark, Brandon McGinley. Thank you so much. A pleasure. He's an editor for our EWTN publishing effort. We're really excited about it. The book itself is by Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, with an introduction by Lech Walesa. I hope Father Mitch is happy with my pronunciation. Sanctify Your Daily Life, How to Transform Work into a Source of Strength, Holiness, and Joy. We could use it now. Check it out. It's available through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. This has been Bookmark. We'll see you next time. Thanks.